Well, on Tuesday night, President Donald Trump gave his first State of the Union speech as president. I am joined now by Congressman French Hill from Washington, D.C. for a little reaction. Congressman, good to have you with us. I want to hear what your first, most positive takeaway was from the speech that you heard on Tuesday night.
Well, Roby, thanks for the invitation. I thought Donald Trump delivered an aspirational speech that talked about his vision for the future and was a good speech in terms of its attempt to bring both sides of the political spectrum together for some joint objectives, which is a good national security plan that works for our country and an economic policy program that will produce more jobs and more and faster economic growth.
Was there any negatives that you heard in terms of, did you hear something that you didn't particularly like?
Well, I think there are issues with President Trump's approach to trade that will require really careful work with the Congress and in the executive branch itself on how you do get trade deals that work for the American worker and for our American economy, and yet recognize that we're in a global economy where trade is essential. You know the talking point, 95% of the world's customers are outside the United States. And we've worked for 30 years to integrate production in North America between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and some 300,000 Arkansans are connected to that Canadian and Mexican trade. So I'm not, it's not a negative thing from the speech, but it's something I think that's going to take careful policy work to get right.
Yeah, free trade is something where I figure there will be a little bit of disagreement between Donald Trump and some traditional Republicans. His staff says to always let his actions speak louder than words. So I think while the speech got some pretty good accolades, I thought he spoke a little bit beyond his typical base of supporters, which was nice to hear. Let's talk about a couple of the specifics that he did mention in there, and let's begin with immigration. He called for a bipartisan approach to immigration. We've had bipartisan approaches to immigration before in Congress. What's going to be different this time? And would you support a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants that are here in this country?
This is an exciting time in our energy history, with incredible progress being made.
Good question. I thought that was very interesting that he brought up a desire for comprehensive immigration reform. You've heard that before. I've heard it before. It's never been successful since the Reagan days because it's never been connected with this issue of true border security, something Donald Trump campaigned on and has a lot of street cred related to. I think that means that if he can get the border security situation working right and convince the American people that he was successful in doing that, that gives him then the political credibility, I think, to then talk about comprehensive immigration reform. And he brought up a new subject, which is merit-based immigration reform, which is really a change in how we've done immigration policy since the 1960s.
Do you support that? Do you support this merit-based? What would that entail for you to be supportive of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting. It talks about, when I think about merit-based, it's both skilled and unskilled labor, and it's based on a change in approach from a purely genealogical family unification approach. When we had family unification beginning in the 1920s, the 1960s, we said if you immigrate to this country, you can legally immigrate to this country. You could bring your parents over from the old country to the United States. Or if you were married, you could bring your spouse over. But then it extended to brothers and sisters, sisters-in-law, cousins, and really the family unification definition became very, very broad and drove our immigration policy and took up a lot of the immigration visa, green card capability that we had, limiting then unskilled and skilled workforce. So it is a different approach. I think it could lead to a better balance in our immigration system. So I'm very eager to hear what he has to say and certainly look at it compared to our prior policy.
Let's talk about another subject that he brought up, and that would be infrastructure. He's advocating for $1 trillion in infrastructure spending. Also, we have heard the president talk about a $54 billion increase in defense spending as a proposal. You're a former banker. You can do math. $1 trillion plus $54 billion and not a whole lot on entitlement reform. That is that's a budget buster right there. How do How do you feel about a $1 trillion infrastructure package? How would that be paid for?
Good question, and let's start out, is the $1 trillion in some sort of an upfront approach, or is it $100 billion over 10 years? That was left unsaid last night. He did mention both public and private infrastructure investment. So how much of the trillion would be private sector, such as the expansion of the Keystone Pipeline or the Dakota Pipeline, just to name two? How would we set priorities for what kind of infrastructure? Donald Trump is consistently talking about airports. Airports, in my view, are actually one of the sources of infrastructure in our country that is well financed and under constant renovation and updating. So I'd be interested in what time frame, what are the emphasis under the infrastructure, how much is public and private, and then to your point about how to pay for it, some schemes have connected it to the tax reform, where we would incent corporations who are going to bring capital back over to the United States, because we do get a territorial tax reform accomplished, that if they invest some of that capital in a infrastructure bonding program across the country, that they would then have that portion of the investment that got brought into the United States tax-free over, say, 20 years. So I haven't seen the financing proposals, but to go borrow money in the Treasury market to do it is something that I'd have difficulty personally supporting.
Well, this whole discussion too about potential tax reform to help pay for some of this infrastructure, some of this additional spending, that gets tricky as well too. I mean, we've seen the state of Kansas kind of gamble their economy a little bit in a negative way on that. If you go back to the Reagan years in the 80s, the deficit exploded because of the supposed trickle-down economics that would occur. It seems like we've been down that road before. I would argue you wouldn't run your bank that way. So, I mean, there's going to have to be a more conservative approach, it seems to me, to balancing this budget. Am I wrong on that?
Well, no, there's no doubt that people in Congress in both the House and Senate are very sensitive to out-year deficit forecasts. We have the debt ceiling vote that will come up this year. We have not seen President Trump's overall budget. That's something that's important. You referenced his top line number on defense spending that was mentioned, but that's not put in context of the entire spending inside the domestic budget as well. And then finally, I have been disappointed by both the Democratic nominee and our Republican nominee during the campaign, not really talking about how we address long-term entitlement spending reform. It's 2/3 of spending, as you and I've talked about for over a decade, and it is the principal driver to our long-term deficit forecast. Reforming the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and trying to get more competition and more price competition into health care would be a contributor to lower long-term deficits, but it's still a major issue, and I think you raise a concern, and it's a valid concern.
It's a good segue. I want to touch on health care reform and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act here. You mentioned one thing about finding ways to increase more competition, and that is certainly a huge component of this. There's been a lot of talk, too, about HSAs and tax credits as a way to help people. My experience with those two mechanisms has been it does not benefit low-income individuals as much as people think it would in theory. It's difficult to find that money for savings. It's typical to not tap into that money for savings. Right. It seems like there's going to have to be something a little more comprehensive in terms of healthcare reform than just those two solutions.
Well, one thing on the tax credit side, Roby, for lower income families, not people on Medicaid, but people who are working, but they live from paycheck to paycheck. They don't have the resources to hit what has become an explosion in healthcare costs. We were told the Affordable Care Act would reduce expenses. It's been just the opposite. Skyrocketing deductibles, very high premium increases, causing families to have to spend between $20,000 and $30,000 out of pocket on healthcare. This is just nonsensical from my point of view, and the real reason why the ACA is collapsing. But for that working family, to your point about HSAs and tax credits, one idea is to do a refundable tax credit for people at that point on the income spectrum, Roby, that means they get the money whether they have the high taxable income or not, and it could be deposited directly into an HSA to be used for premiums or meeting deductibles. That way they have access to that cash up front. It's not something they wait till the end of the year to claim.
Still tricky though. I've worked through an HSA before, and it can be a little bit complicated. And it's not always enough money at some points in time, depending on what your health care need is. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think you and I, again, from business points of view, we've talked about this. Look, buying health care through the group with your company or individually is complicated, and it's complicated to people with the absolute best knowledge about insurance agents, and it's tough to understand. So you're right, it's complicated, and I think we've seen that even in the work in the past 3 or 4 years of trying to implement the Affordable Care Act. It's complicated, and people really struggle with this issue and struggle with how to help their family and try to make the best decision they can.
Well, to quote the president there, who knew healthcare could be so complicated and so complex? So last question for you. You have received some criticism for not doing town halls during your most recent recess here. I know you did have a busy schedule and did connect with some constituents in some smaller group settings, but tell people why you did not hold any town halls in this last recess.
Well, I do events and have since I was a candidate back in 2014. Every week I'm in Arkansas. I do events, public events open to press, open to the public. And last week, for example, I did an event Saturday morning at the state capitol, in front of the state capitol, with my friends Muskie Harris and Fitz Hill. It was well advertised that Richard Mays and I were the co-chairman of the event. It was the race to end violence, to bring our whole community together to end gun violence in Little Rock and take back our community. And then on Tuesday of that week, advertised in the Democrat Gazette, I had a open house and chamber event to talk about ways to get the economy growing faster. So every week I'm home, I do public events and try to get around to as many of the 7 counties as I can. And on top of that, we do lots, as you said, of small group meetings. Like last week, I did small group meetings with the citizens from India in Little Rock who were concerned about the immigration topic. I did events with all the healthcare providers on how the ACA is going to be changed. And we do these all the time. And of course we do the teletown halls where last week, I think or 2 weeks ago, we had about 2,500 people answering questions all over the map of concern to Arkansans in the 2nd District. So I won't stop being out and won't stop doing public events, and appreciate you asking that question.
But no forum specifically for just fielding a constituent's microphone questions like you saw with Senator Cotton, Representative Womack over the recess.
We do. I'm invited to do those, as I say, on a regular basis by groups in the counties, and I try to go to as many as I can, whether it's at a Chamber of Commerce or a hospital open house or high school. There's an untold number of ways I do that every time I'm back at home.
All right, Congressman French Hill, thank you for doing a town hall of 1 with me this morning. We're going to share it with the masses.
Hey man, it's my pleasure.
I appreciate you very much.